Our documentary begins with a man narrating that every town has its legends. Every neighborhood has its boogeyman. As he talks, we observe a ruined area. The narrator, Joshua Zeman, says the legend from his place of living revolved around Cropsey. It's about an escaped mental patient who lived in the buildings that are being recorded. He would snatch off the streets. Unfortunately, this legend turned into a reality when 5 children went missing. We briefly see photos of the kids. The narrator tells us that understanding the real story behind Cropsey inspired him and his associate, Rachel, to investigate other urban legends. What they uncovered during their search was truths that were more horrific than any fiction. Then we see them walking in the ruined area. Joshua says this is where Cropsey was believed to live in. There is an interesting painting there of a wolf on the wall. Rachel asks Joshua if every urban legend has truth behind it. He answers that something needs to be there to spark it. He also says these are stories that fuel one's nightmares. Moving along, Joshua rouses our curiosity by asking us why we believe in such legends. He answers that maybe we need to believe in something because the reality could be much worse. A few real-life horrible events are shown to complement his words. So instead of dealing with reality, we create our own monsters. This documentary is an attempt for the documenting duo to uncover the source of their nightmares. He says urban legends are merely warnings for something more dangerous. Diving into the topic, Joshua starts talking about the first legend, which is called The Hook. A teenage couple was parked in a lover's lane. While they engaged in romance, the radio informed them that a patient escaped from a nearby asylum with a hook for an arm. Eventually, the boy in the car discovered the maniac's bloody hook on the car door, disconnected from the maniac. After that, we switched to seeing Stephen Winnick talk about this legend. He says it originated in the 1950s. Joshua chimes in to say the hook is actually a cautionary tale warning teenagers about the dangers of intimacy. Stephen continues to say that the hook captured a certain danger involved with such teenage behavior, especially how it took place inside vehicles. Then we get introduced to the masked murderer from Texarkana known as the Phantom. In 1946, he attacked 4 couples parked on lovers' lanes. What's terrifying is that he was never caught. This made his legacy haunt the town for more than 6 decades. A driver noticed a car parked on Lover's Lane. Inside, he found a couple lying in the back seat. He was the unlucky one to find them both shot in their heads. Following this, the documenters ask an elder woman about the Phantom. She informs them that her town had a lot of speculation about who he was, but no one was ever brought to justice. She takes them to the site to show them where it happened. Joshua tells us, it is believed the poor lady was out of the car before being put back into it. The next authoritative person who speaks is James Presley. He says the main suspect was Yowell Swinney, who was an ex-convict. He was arrested with his wife, and she said Yowell was the Phantom. Despite the case falling apart quickly, the judge still sent Yowell to prison for life for being a constant car thief. James says there have been many other suspects. People made all sorts of theories concerning who the Phantom was. Then an interesting case happened with another couple that was attacked on a lover's lane. Both of them survived their attack because a car scared the Phantom away. Joshua starts going over the details of what took place at that time. After what the Phantom did to the girl, she said she would rather have been brought to her demise than what she received. Rachel says that boy and girl were the only people who saw the Phantom. Eventually, a movie was made about this phenomenon in 1976. It was called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Its take on the Phantom influenced future cinematic boogeymen. Media manager, Casey Roberts, takes our duo to one of the locations from the film. The man tells them that Yowell was an easy target to pin the crimes on. Plus, the people needed to pin it on someone. He tells them of a man who took his own. He left a note saying he was the Phantom. Afterward, the documenters use a microfiche to search for information. They find a movie there that the name of the Phantom must have been taken from. It's called Phantom Speaks. Joshua narrates how they just witnessed an important step in the creation of any urban legend, the naming of its boogeyman. Another professional, Bill Ellis, informs us that people will put a name on something that gives them fear. By doing this, people acquire some feeling of control. Then at a place called Spring Lake Park, the Phantom brought another attack that immortalized his name. 2 more teenagers lost their lives to his doings. Their demise created a panic that gripped the town and never let go. It's sad how young the couple was. 15 years of age for the girl, 16 for the boy. The documenters are at the scene of the crime, with Joshua talking again about what happened. The strange thing is that the boy was found in the morning, but the girl was not. Once she was located, it was on the edge of a forgotten road, which was 2 miles away from the lifeless boy. So Joshua goes to that frightening road with Rachel, who says the girl was shot twice. A bullet to the chest and 1 to the head. Strangely, her hand was put into her pocket. Joshua feels bad that no one will ever know who took her life. He narrates that coming out there is as scary as any horror film, sometimes even more. After that, the two of them meet Mark Bledsoe, a former probation officer. He was obsessed with this case to the point that he conducted his own investigation. He was one of the few people to interview Yowell in recent years. The man who was previously sentenced to prison for life is no longer there, living in a Texas nursing home. As one might expect, Yowell is now very old in addition to having suffered a stroke. He tells Mark he spent 50 years in jail. This is simply an unimaginable amount of time to be imprisoned for. In his old age, he denies being the Phantom. He wishes the culprit to get caught. Soon some personnel enter the room to say videotaping isn't allowed there. This upsets the documenters after seeing the interview cut short. Joshua narrates they may never know who the Phantom is. He continues to say it's these lack of answers that keeps the legend alive for the youth in Texarkana. Rachel adds that it's more romantic to believe in the myth than to have the facts. Finishing the investigation of the first urban legend, the narrator from the 70s movie says, "The Phantom is believed to be living free among the townsfolk of Texarkana." That quote from the movie seems to satisfy our duo, as being the closing words regarding the legend of the Phantom. Moving along, we enter the world of the second urban legend, the Candyman. Joshua starts talking about the film of the same name. It's about an expert who investigates the boogeyman. The Candyman in that movie haunts a housing project in Chicago. He also has a hook for a hand. The man behind this villain committed one of the most horrific crimes. Before we venture into his crime, we are presented with a comic about Halloween that appropriately introduces us to this legend. A boy gets told by his mother not to go trick or treating in unfamiliar places, but he does not listen to her and tells his friends to get candy from a strange house. Then a scream occurs. The kids are rushed to the hospital, where the boy loses his life due to eating candy laced with poison. The other kids perish in horrific ways too. The last drawing in this dark comic shows us several people in cloaks who are performing a ritual. Supposedly, Halloween comes from an ancient custom of druids who collected kids for those murders were committed by those who carry that evil tradition. From that, we segue into a newspaper article stating that poison was given to during Halloween. It took place on Long Island in 1964. Helen Fail was upset with older kids engaging in trick-or-treating, so she dealt with it by giving out poison and buttons among other items that weren't candy. Although she testified that it was a joke, the sociologist, Joel Best, informs us that some schools have stopped celebrating Halloween. New Jersey passed a law specifying penalties for people who were caught contaminating Halloween treats. Joshua narrates that a grisly case of tainted candy brought this nightmare to life on Halloween in Pasadena, Texas. With the preliminaries out of the way, this is us finally getting into the crime of the Candyman. In 1974, a man named Ronald O'Brien let his young children eat candy before going to bed. Minutes later, his son of age 8 was vomiting violently. He sadly lost his life in the hospital because of cyanide poisoning. Thankfully, though, his younger sister did not suffer the same fate. Ed Goad of the police department says he was off duty that night. Then he received a call from one of his detectives. Arriving at the hospital, he was disturbed greatly by the boy's demise, for he resembled his son very much. That night he promised Ronald he would catch the person who gave him that contaminated candy. After his son's funeral, Ronald identified a woman named Courtney Melvin, who he claimed to have received the candy from. The problem with pointing her out was that she had an alibi. Soon Joshua informs us that the culprit behind the boy's demise was more horrific than what anyone imagined. The documenters arrive at a certain house and Rachel even feels uncomfortable going there. The house happens to be the former home of Ronald. Joshua talks to an elder woman, who is the current homeowner. She never heard of Ronald O'Brien. That is when we learn the shocking truth. He tells her Ronald is the one who took his son's life. He is the Candyman. Subsequently, we see a newsman talking about how Ronald was arrested on murder charges of his son. The police discovered that he had taken out a large insurance policy on his kids, but not on himself or his wife. He also talked to many people about losing one's life to cyanide. The wicked man even tried to buy the chemical from local stores. All the evidence pointed to Ronald as the murderer of his son. Joel goes on to say that he never heard of a case of someone getting seriously hurt from contaminated candy brought upon by trick or treating. This is just more evidence that Ronald did what he was accused of doing. Following this, the former assistant district attorney, Mike Hinton, talks about the Candyman. He says they all thought exactly what he wanted them to think. Mike has a hard time talking about him, due to how vile Ronald is in his mind. He says the people of this case were forever affected by what he did. He also wanted to keep this case to see justice being served. To him, that meant Ronald deservedly meeting his demise. It took a mere 45 minutes for the jury to find him guilty and another 75 to sentence him to his end. As fate would have it, the Candyman was scheduled to lose his life on Halloween, the same day he ended his son. We listen to Ronald talk about how he denies having committed the awful crime along with him, not worrying about losing his life because he knows where he is going. Knowing the place Ronald had in mind, Mike disagrees by saying he's going straight to hell. The Candyman was taken to Huntsville Prison. To this day, it is home to the most active execution chamber in the United States. However, despite Ronald's crime, he still had supporters. Professor of law David Crump says some people supported him despite the huge evidence pointing to him being guilty. In addition to the magnitude of his crime, the people who did this are those who are categorically opposed to execution. Then we see a man interviewing Ronald in prison. He tells him it looks like he will be executed. Ronald acknowledges that it's a possibility. Most Americans want it to happen. The interviewer adds, they are upset with Ronald still being alive. But the Candyman doesn't think revenge is right. He says society isn't entitled to such an action, being accused of ruining Halloween for everyone. He says that's a matter of opinion. On the day of his execution, demonstrators were outside the prison. They were waiting for the announcement they wanted to hear. 40 minutes past midnight, the man was finally given his lethal injection. He never did admit to taking his son's life, yet he had a final written statement where he asked to be forgiven. This statement is read to the crowd by a prison spokesman. Ronald's ex-wife saw the execution as the end to a nightmare and the chance for a new beginning. Joshua narrates that eliminating the man who ruined Halloween seemed justified. Bill Ellis, a professor, tells us that Ronald desecrated the idea of this holiday by taking a scary story to literally make it true. He used the urban legend as an alibi. Returning to Ronald's interview one last time, the interviewer asks him the final question concerning what his inmates call him. He asks if they call him the Candyman. Ronald simply forms a smile that seems to communicate he would rather not talk about it. This is also the smile that concludes this section of the documentary. Jumping into the third urban legend, we are presented with several movies that have babysitters getting phone calls from mysterious strangers. They all follow a similar formula. First, the girl hangs up because she thinks it's a prank call. Second, the stranger calls again. The third step is the scared babysitter reporting the call to the police. Finally, the police call back to deliver the terrifying news of the caller being in the same house as the one occupied by the babysitter. The title of this urban legend is The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. Joshua asks if there is any truth behind this legend. Rachel talks about her experience as a babysitter. It scared her to be in a strange house while hearing strange sounds. Stephen Winnick returns to educate us that babysitting does not increase one's chance of being attacked. It would be an utterly random event for a babysitter to be attacked during a burglary. Moving into an actual case regarding this legend, Joshua says they found a woman named Janet Christman from Missouri whom it centers around. The one to talk about her is Janet's friend, Carrie Haley Holt. They were friends from the first grade to the time of Janet's premature demise. We see a photo of her from 1950 at the very young age of 13 years. She was babysitting for the Romack family. Carrie was also partaking in the same job that night. On the next morning, Carrie's mom answered a phone call from which she learned the dreadful news that Janet had been brought to her end while babysitting. During her attack, Janet managed to call the police, but all they heard were her screams. Unable to trace the call, they were helpless to save her. Carrie says her friend was strangled with an ironing cord. Sadly, the poor girl's murder was never solved. Then the duo arrives at the house where Janet lost her life. They learn from an elderly man who lives there that he spoke to the person who was the baby Janet was babysitting on her final day. Marilou Jenkins is another female victim of the same unfortunate crime. In 1946, at the older age of 20, the girl was home alone. Her mom returned in the morning to find her daughter in a deceased state. Interestingly, she too was strangled by a cord. A man named Floyd Cochran had been arrested for taking his wife's life. He was charged with Marilou's murder and quickly executed for it. The historian, Mary Brown, believes Floyd did not take the girl's life. Janet and Marilou losing their lives in a similar way proves Floyd's innocence to the historian. They also met their demise within 2 blocks of each other. Mary thinks the same person murdered both girls, but that person was likely Robert Mueller. We learn Robert was a high school friend of Ed Romack, the man whose house Janet did her babysitting in. Although Robert passed a polygraph test, the police still thought they had enough evidence to arrest him. However, a grand jury refused to indict him, so the man was never tried for Janet's demise. Searching through old files, Rachel discovers that Robert had known Janet. He admired her figure. Furthermore, the documenters learned that Robert's wife called Janet to babysit at their home that night. Yet she found out the girl was already asked by the Romax. Joshua reasons that Robert could have easily known from this that Janet would be alone there. He agrees this sounds like Robert committed the crime. Afterward, the local historian, Joan Sorrell, speaks. She says other happened between the two presented to us. Again, somewhere within close distance, another girl was by a man wearing a mask. She shares an interesting detail that Robert liked the theater, and he made masks. A man named Jake Bradford was charged for the duo arrives at a creek. Joshua explains how a man pulled a girl out of a car into the woods. He was wearing a mask. He also put a mask on her. Stephen tells us most teenagers in the United States go through a period of babysitting at least one time. Despite not being dangerous, it feels terrifying. There is no reason for any potential culprit to know a babysitter is on duty. When a culprit already knows someone is babysitting, that is when a crime could take place. This is how it likely happened in our two unfortunate cases. The duo then talks to Peter Brent, a profiler, over a video call. Like Mary Brown, he also thinks the same person murdered both of the girls. He believes Marilou knew her murderer. Regarding Janet, Peter says Ed Romack showed her how to use the shotgun by the front door. Since her murderer broke the window prior to entering the house, he likely did it to distract her from attaining the shotgun. This means not only did he know there was a shotgun, but he knew exactly where it was. Peter thinks Robert fits very well into being the culprit. The problem is that others do too. Joshua brings up the good point that the murders stopped with Robert leaving town. However, Peter counters this point by saying many males went to Korea at that time. The true perpetrator could have been among them. Finishing our third urban legend, Bill Ellis informs us that there isn't a strong tradition in the United States of strangers taking the lives of babysitters. Joshua closes this section by saying Janet knew her murderer. If it was Robert, then he wasn't a stranger. For the final legend, the documenters traveled to Chicago. Despite being about clowns, it certainly isn't a joke. We are told that people used to think of clowns as happy characters. Before modern times, the jester was a trickster who mocked nobility. They could even take up a vile role. Joshua piques our curiosity by asking what is it about modern clowns that turned them into something evil. We see the news saying the police warned parents about a man dressed as a clown who was approaching children. He tried to lure boys into his vehicle. Soon we see a clown driving a van. The sight of it is disturbing because of what we just heard. Our duo walks into an area of a theoretical clown abduction. They ask a random person there if he believes the incident took place. The man does not deny it's happening. People told him they had seen it. More people in the town are talked to who believe it too. Following this, Joe Derwin says coulrophobia is the fear of clowns. People know that clowns are now these scary subjects. In the last few decades, it has become confirmed. We transition to a place called Cabrini Green, one of Chicago's slums. Joshua asks a few of its residents if they think clowns are scary. One of them says they are not. Another simply says, murderous clowns, meaning those are the ones who bring fear. Joshua asks us why were clowns the subject of fear. Perhaps it was the clown's loss of innocence that made them scary, for it spoke to our own loss. Then the most evil clown gets mentioned. He was Pogo, the alter ego of the serial murderer John Wayne Gacy. He slayed 33 young males between 1972 and 1978. The former prosecutor, Bob Egan, says he first thought Pogo was acting like a clown to get victims. But his reason was that he was the center of attention. Everything he did was to make himself such. After that, Bob shines some insight into Pogo's makeup. He talks about the sharp features on his clown face. Clown experts state that clowns don't have sharp points on their faces. The reason is that the sharpness scares kids in addition to connoting evil. Interestingly, Bob is rather certain that John Gacy was not conscious of how his makeup appeared. Subsequently, we see a drawing of Pogo as painted by the man himself. The next scene has the historian, Ken Melvoin Berg, saying it doesn't matter what kind of mask a person puts on. It is being done to hide who one is, if even by a small amount. The mask often portrays a persona that is the opposite of the person wearing it. Ken says that a truly evil person like Gacy puts it on to offset his personality. Bill Ellis adds to this point by informing us that what happens when people costume themselves is they are playing with internal personalities. They are repressing their normal ego to allow a different personality to become dominant. One becomes someone unpredictable in clown attire, someone who is possibly dangerous. Soon our documenters ride with Ken as he drives his car while costumed as a clown. He talks about clown history, finishing his brief lesson by telling the duo to check out a place called Showman's Rest. It is a monument in the cemetery to the circus and its clowns. In 1918, a train plowed into the sleeper cars of the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus. Tragically, 86 clowns lost their lives in this catastrophe. They were buried in the mass grave, Showman's Rest. One of the performers who survived was Joe Coyle. His act became morose after the incident. He would sadly remain that way for the rest of his life. Rachel reads how his wife and 2 children perished in that train wreck. Joe wished he could have joined them when it occurred. Then Joshua visits Showman's Rest with Rachel. Reading the names on the graves mostly gives them the 2 unsatisfactory words, unknown male. But one has the nickname Baldy on it. 4-horse driver is the other one who seems to have been identified. Having learned about this, Joshua narrates that maybe the clown scare started with the demise of all those clowns. Maybe what it takes is a tragedy to unlock the dark places in people's minds. We transition to seeing a shooting at a movie theater. The movie, The Dark Knight Rises, was being shown. In 2012, a young guy named James Holmes committed one of the worst mass shootings in recent history. The Joker from The Dark Knight is presented to say how he is an agent of chaos. Supposedly, James tried to be such an agent too by dressing up in his clothing. Joe Derwin reappears to say people felt a compulsion to water down the clown into a cartoonish thing. One of the most interesting insights in this documentary is his saying that maybe the underlying traits of the clown archetype came back with a vengeance. As he says this, we see images of the evil jesters to support his point. They do not allow the modern clowns they influence to remain hidden in their innocent roles. In conclusion, Joshua asks us, what can we learn from these 4 urban legends? By presenting false boogeymen, these legends are helping us make sense of crimes too wicked to comprehend. In the end, the real boogeyman is the one lurking inside of us, waiting for the right moment to emerge. We shouldn't be afraid of the story, but rather of the storyteller.